So, hello everyone, and a very warm welcome to this webinar entitled What's Next for Armenia? Foreign Policy and Domestic Politics Amidst Regional Change, organized within the framework of the international research project REDEMOS. My name is Tobias Schumacher. I am a professor of European Studies at the Norwegian University of Science and Technology, NTNU, here in Trondheim, Norway. I'm a non-resident professorial fellow at the College of Europe, Natolin in Warsaw. And most importantly, I guess, in the context of today's webinar, I am the deputy coordinator of this international research project, REDEMOS. It is my pleasure of being your host today, and to moderate this conversation with Professor Anna Ohanyan, as well as Professor Nerses Kopalyan, who I welcome particularly and thank for being part of today's webinar, and who I will introduce, of course, in a moment. Now, before I do that, and before I actually also make a couple of introductory remarks, so to speak, about today's topic, allow me to just say a very few sentences, in particular to our listeners, our viewers, about our research project, in the context of which, as I said, this webinar is taking place. REDEMOS is an abbreviation for Reconfiguring EU Democracy Support towards a sustained demos in the EU's Eastern neighborhood. It's an international research project funded by the European Union's Horizon Europe framework, and it runs from the 1st of January 2023 until the end of December 2025. Under the leadership of my colleague, Dr. Magdalena Dobresko, and myself, and our very competent team here in Norway, REDEMOS brings together a total of 11 European universities, research centers, think tanks, as well as one web solution-oriented small and medium-sized enterprise. We are endowed with a budget of approximately 3.7 million euro. And this project is destined to generate cutting-edge research, if you wish, and to provide very concrete policy advice to the European Union with respect to EU and EU member states' democracy support actions or efforts in what Brussels is considering to be its eastern neighborhood. REDEMOS is officially mandated by the EU to elaborate a new and innovative, as they say, policy toolkit for future proving democracy in Eastern Europe, so to speak, in order to shift from past mistakes or repeating past mistakes to tackling present challenges, particularly in light of a significantly altered, or if you wish, continuously altering security landscape in Europe. Now, this brings us directly to today's topic. Arguably, Armenia is particularly exposed to these alterations on both the regional and sort of more global level, or European level at least, not least as Russia's unjustified and unprovoked war of aggression on Ukraine has emboldened an already highly assertive and, in fact, bellicose Azerbaijan to not just expel the entire Armenian population of Nagorno-Karabakh in the autumn of last year, but to also issue on a rather regular basis unveiled and straightforward threats vis-à-vis Armenia's sovereignty, whilst regularly infringing on Armenia's territorial integrity and provoking Armenia into military skirmishes of sorts. Now, this aggressive behavior and posturing, if you wish, occurs with a view to create facts on the ground, as far as, for example, the creation of the Zangezur corridor in southwestern Armenia is concerned, as far as further territorial concessions on the part of Armenia is concerned, in parallel to presumptive peace deliberations in light of Prime Minister Pashinyan's Crossroads for Peace proposal. Now, this is compounded by the fact that Russia, Yerevan's long-standing strategic ally, focusing on its brutal war of attrition in Ukraine, is using Armenia's vulnerability, geography-wise, security-wise, economy-wise, energy-wise, as a pawn acting increasingly hostile towards the government of Prime Minister Pashinyan in particular. Now, in a nutshell, these dynamics are exposing Armenia's foreign policy of complementarism, if you wish. That is to say, the balancing of at least past strategic and friendly relations with Russia on the one hand and engagement with the West on the other, to rather unprecedented challenges. As a result, the Pashinyan government has been intensifying relations with the European Union, with individual member states and others. It has been declaring a freeze of the country's membership in the Russia-led CSTO. It has been concluding arms contracts with various countries over the past couple of months. It has even been openly speaking about EU membership. Now, how these and many other recent developments in Armenian foreign and security policy are impacting on domestic political and thus democratic development in the country, and likewise, how domestic dynamics in Armenia itself are driving recent foreign policy changes will be very much at the center of this webinar, of this conversation today, featuring once again Anna Ohanyan and Nerses Kopalyan. So by way of introducing our two guest speakers, let me start with Anna Ohanyan, and by saying that Anna is the Richard B. Finnegan Distinguished Professor of Political Science and International Relations at Stonehill College in Easton, Massachusetts, which is, as I learned previously, just a couple of minutes ago, just some 20 minutes outside Boston. And she's also a non-resident scholar in the Russia and Eurasia program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Anna has published widely and impressively, I should say, on the geopolitics of Eurasia, with a particular focus on geopolitics, on conflict resolution, network governance, networked regionalism and institutionalism, also with a strong focus on Armenia, but not exclusive, I should add, to name but a few strands of her research. And her latest book, published by Stanford University Press some 2 years ago, is actually called The Neighborhood Effect, the Imperial Roots of Regional Fracture in Eurasia. A very warm welcome to you, Anna, and thank you for being with us. Nerses Kopalyan, our other guest speaker today, is Associate Professor in Residence at the University of Nevada in Las Vegas, and he has worked and published widely on both domestic politics in Armenia in particular and Armenian foreign policy, security policy as well, I should add, in addition to his work on, in fact, analytic philosophy, feminist theory and paradigm building. We might want to hold another webinar on one of these themes, Nerses. And his last book, published in 2017 by Routledge, is entitled World Political Systems After Polarity. A very warm welcome to you too, Nerses. And in fact, good morning, I should say, as you zoom in from the West Coast in the United States. Now, after all these introductory remarks, I would now like to give the digital floor to our two speakers, who will each have approximately 10 minutes to provide us with a first, say, impulse, so to speak, and share with us their initial views on today's theme. And picking up on some of the points that will most certainly be raised, the three of us will then engage in a conversation for another approximately 15 to 20 minutes, and we shall then open the floor to have ideally an interactive Q&A and involve our audience. On this note, once again, Thank you to our speakers. Thank you to our listeners and viewers for being with us today. And may I ask you, Anna, to kickstart the conversation. The floor is yours.
Sure. Thank you very much, Tobias, and to REDEMOS for organizing this event. And I'm really excited that there is such institutional thinking at the EU level in rethinking about democracy support. And so I will definitely keep that context in mind. What I would do, I'm going to share some slides, but these are, again, largely to keep me disciplined so I don't veer too off course, and so that I can also get in some of the key takeaways that I would like to leave you with. And if you see too much text, please don't be alarmed. I'm not going to go through every single slide. So in terms of what I would like to do there, what you see on the first slide is the sort of the core arguments, key takeaways that I would like to leave you with. And having Nerses on a panel is really a great advantage because he works with the government very closely in terms of providing institutional support, all kinds of policy papers that he's doing. So he has a much better grasp over the nitty-gritty of the daily grind that democracy is. What I would like to do is to leave you with a conceptual framework, which I do think is helpful in thinking about Armenia, as well as countries like Georgia, Azerbaijan as well, Moldova, Ukraine. So essentially, this is a framework. What I do think is this is how I think about how the post-Soviet spaces, post-communist spaces are being reconfigured within this largely new imperial continent. So the key takeaway here, what I would argue, is that Armenia's both domestic and foreign policy needs to be, what I argue, to be analyzed within this new imperial frame of analysis. And the key background condition here is with the Russian invasion in Ukraine, what I call Putin's pivot from the West, from multipolarity towards east of the Eurasian continent. And if we're any pivot that matters in the South Caucasus, I argue it's that Putin's pivot that I think we need to study closely, in that this Putin's pivot ended the Pax Russica in the South Caucasus. Armenia's agency as a small state, I very much view in this context. I also would like to stress the global stakes for Armenia's democratic consolidation and state security. This is not specific. I think whatever happens to Armenia, I would like to make the argument that is hugely consequential as to on the forms of ordering, whether liberal or neoliberal, within the continent in general. And here, the rise of Fortress Eurasia argument that I find fascinating by Hal Brands. I wrote about this in Foreign Policy. But also, as Tobias and I were talking earlier, to enhance the EU's democracy support for South Caucasus. The last point, I would argue, starts from supporting and consolidating border stability in the South Caucasus, or not Armenia in particular. And there's some, I will talk about this as well, but I do think that this is the necessary, perhaps not sufficient condition. And the fact that the EU civilian monitors are on the border is hugely significant in geopolitical terms. But perhaps we can talk about border delimitation and border stability later on as well, perhaps in Q&A. So in terms of, let me see, I don't know how to can manage my own. So apologize for too much text, but super quickly, what does it mean to have this new imperial frame in understanding Armenia's agency as a small state? The alternative frameworks to understand, which are more dominant forms of understanding Armenia, is the sort of this traditional geopolitical analysis, or looking at its democratic consolidation from the comparative democratization theories. But the new imperial approach to understanding Armenia's domestic and foreign policy is necessary because it's a reminder that this remains a largely neo-imperial continent, with Russia, China, Turkey very much practicing this very specific type of geopolitics, much more insidious forms of geopolitics, which does not recognize borders, views violence as a legitimate tool of ordering, and deny stability and rules-based ordering, all of which contradict the logic of survival for small states. So the neo-imperial frame is also important because it reminds us of the co-constitution between the periphery, in this case Armenia or Georgia or Azerbaijan, you name it, the co-constitution between the metropole and the periphery. And in this respect, with the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1990s, essentially, many rushed to celebrate the end of the Cold War, and some circles within the United States celebrated as we won, a description that I always challenged and did not like, to put it mildly. But there's a great continuity between the collapse of the Soviet Union and whatever political systems that emerged. Without dwelling too much, I simply wanted to highlight that when you use neo-imperial frame of analysis, it shows you the continuity of elite cooperation, economic elite cooperation between Armenia and Russia, for example, as well as continuity of civic politics within Armenia from currently all the way through the pre-Soviet period. So in terms of the viewed in this context, while in cases of new democratic transitions, the problem of managing the old elites in new democracies, this is a lot of research on this. There are all kinds of best practices how to do it. You integrate the old elites, hopefully they participate in democratic politics, etc. Well, within new imperial content, is much harder to do because the vestige powers, old elites, are very much keep an eye, look at the metropole, the presence, Russia as a background condition, and in deciding whether they play with the new rules, in the new rules of democratic politics or not. That is not to blame everything on Russia. I want to highlight this. And I think there's a lot that the current Armenian government can do in terms of managing the discourse in preventing polarization that will be coming. I don't think Armenia's politics, this might sound controversial, I don't think Armenia's politics systematically is polarized right now. There is an opening for the Armenian state to prevent us to what's happening in Georgia, I'm afraid. So in terms of the Russian invasion in Ukraine, which I argue this is the Soviet collapse 2.0, and this really is a period in which this Putin's threat catalyzed the end of Pax Russica. What this meant with the Russian invasion in Ukraine, all of a sudden, looking at Armenia-Kazakhstan diplomacy, for example, is fascinating to me. All of the post-Soviet states, not all actually, for example, for Azerbaijan, it's quite different. The dynamics is different. It's a declining petrostate. It's a personalized autocracy. GDP per capita right now in Azerbaijan is the lowest in the region. It's the lowest relative to Central Asian oil states. So that's the politics is a little bit different here. But with the Russian invasion in Ukraine, this really accelerated, elevated, advanced the politics of norm building around norms against conquest, norms for territorial integrity. And these norms, the Soviet collapse, the border stability was very much international practice, has been to the new borders would derive from the principle of iutai possidetis, meaning the administrative borders of the Soviet Union would be the new borders of the 15 republics. And this norm is not a European norm. This is this comes from Latin America at the end of the 19th century. So what I argue in this context, this new period of the sort of the end, the Soviet collapse 2.0, it is, I'm observing this process of strengthening, deepening of this liberal ordering of the world. And as to what happens in South Caucasus is hugely consequential as to whether European vision, Western vision of principled rules-based liberal forms of ordering of this largely neo-imperial continent will succeed or not. So in terms of I'm going to skip over this. Armenia is fascinating to me for the following reason. If you look at, there's this great book that I should be promoting my book, but I'm not. I would like you to kind of take a look at this book, Democracy in Hard Places, which is an edited volume by Scott Mainwaring and Tarek Massoud here down the road at Harvard. So what they've argued, they looked at several countries, Argentina, India, Georgia and Moldova, Ukraine are reviewed, East Timor, Timor-Leste. These are countries that are surviving, keeping their democracy despite the range of challenges for democratic consolidation. Structurally, they're not supposed to be able to keep their democracies. Armenia is not included because Armenia's democratic trajectory emerged much later. But what Armenia case in particular is showing is that despite the structural factors against Armenia's democratization, how is it surviving? What can we learn from the Armenia's case? And these are just few quotes here. What the key takeaway here is that what they're arguing here are democracies in hard places, the equivalent of lottery winners, dramatic exceptions to fundamental rules, or there's something systematic that can be gleaned from such cases as to how democracy can be upheld. The key takeaway here is that collective actors who command political resources and influence political competition, and if they have deep normative commitment to democracy, they're more likely. That seems to be the secret sauce in keeping a democracy alive in very hard places. So collective actors could be a dominant political party. Normative commitment to democracy as a political system plays an important role in such cases. In terms of one more point in terms of the Russian invasion in Ukraine and as to how it catalyzes the change in the logic of Armenian statehood moving forward. Russian invasion, Russian war of conquest really catalyzed, translated, regardless whether Kremlin calculated this or not, but basically this is a historically unprecedented development in Russia losing its centrality in the connectivity of the Eurasian continent. So this creates all kinds of leverage opportunities for the West. And I do not think that the West and European Union take full advantage of this dramatic development. As Russia is losing connectivity, its central position within this continent, this elevates the peripheries, geopolitical significance of peripheries. But this is where European Union matters the most in South Caucasus. Whether in this context, it can provide the necessary normative, political, security support for small state survival, because the order building, the future of liberal ordering will be coming in from the small states, from the ground up, trickling bottom up, it will not be coming from the top down. So European Union, I would argue, has this very important role to play in that. And there's lots, the literature on order building does point to the need in managing the borders, border stability. This is how the ordering is taking place, and from continent to continent. I would like to conclude with few thoughts on the border delimitation. And this is, I'm very much worried. On the one hand, it's positive, I would argue. There is an argument to be made that it's positive for Armenia and Azerbaijan to continue to do this bilaterally. And I do think the last deal on the border delimitation was largely, it very much should be viewed in the context of COP29, that Aliyev is looking for legitimacy, is trying to emerge as a quote unquote transit country, as a responsible player. But of course, I mean, the language of peacemaking, peace building, peace process has become a tool of hybrid war strategy in the case for Baku. So we should definitely keep that in the background. But what has been happening since 2020, when we do think about border delimitation, it's important to think in terms of territorial as well as institutional implications of this. With each territorial loss sustained by Armenia, this has led to countervailing institutional gains in its security architecture. And EU observers, new security partnerships, deepening relationship with the EU, new military partnerships with various countries, from India to Paris, right, to France. Perhaps Nerses can jump on this later on. So institutional implications of delineated borders for Azerbaijan, right? It does give greater transparency in international relations. It sends a costly signaling from Armenia to Azerbaijani people for its peaceful intentions, which will weaken Aliyev's war rhetoric. It creates pressure for the Azerbaijani military and it reflects Azerbaijan's transit strategy of statehood as a driver for border delineation. I might be being too optimistic on this, but I think it's worth to talk about. To what extent can we rely on Baku's rhetoric on becoming a transit country as to whether it can play seriously on border delimitation? So I was really surprised when that deal happened, because I do think, and I still think, Azerbaijan is trying to build a territorial conflict. And I will not explain how, because Tobias, you already did it, you covered it. That's exactly what Aliyev is trying to do. And Armenian diplomacy has been, and Nerses has been writing on this as well, has been very effective in dodging that bullet, pun intended, meaning not being provoked into a border conflict, because in the media it will be covered as a border clash, not an attack on Armenia's borders. So Azerbaijan is trying to build a border conflict. The border delineation, in general, quantitative analysis show that is one of the best strategies of reducing rivalry between conflict parties. It is a strategy not necessarily for peace building, because there's a lot more stuff that goes in, structural conditions that needed to build peace, but it is an important mechanism to move to countries from active rivalry to negative peace. Delineated borders strengthen states. And in this case, Alma-Ata agreement reinforced also the Prague summit, so became another focal point in negotiations. So the institutional implications for border delineation are crucial. And this is where I think the European Union, I would argue, does need to play a role. I do not trust that Aliyev is going to play along moving forward. And I'm just nervous. Border delineation is already a complex phenomenon. You already see that border communities are affected. They're nervous for understandable reasons. Border governance needs to be the next step. And European Union as an actor knows the most on border governance. So I'm really surprised in not seeing more EU involvement, more robust institutional involvement in border delineation. Russia cannot be trusted with border delineation. That's just, that's not going to lead anywhere good. Border governance as a central element of strength for Armenia, the challenge being that it has to move from security to control over the borders to border governance. So I'm going to skip over here. I don't see anything here that I need to. What I did want to, I will end here. Studies on border delimitation also show that repeated interactions on border delimitation are positive. So I would hope that Armenian government would deepen, would try to repeat and expand and scale up the border delineation it did in Tavush region. The example of Colombia and Peru, which have had unsettled borders for decades, and they were rivals with no border delimitation for decades, they actually signed a modus vivendi agreement to preserve the status quo while negotiations continued. So I wonder whether Armenian government, I'm almost 100% sure that President Aliyev will be dragging the border delineation for decades. How do I know this? Because he said so. I listened to his COP29 speech where he said, he was asked by Craig Oliphant, do you foresee a peace agreement? Yes, maybe some framework before COP29, and we should manage the expectations from the peace agreement, by the way. But border delineation, he said, that's a different issue. Our border with Georgia is not fully delineated. It's very complicated. There are high mountains. So it was very interesting to see it. There's an administrative border here. Again, Uttai-Prosidaitis, the Soviet collapse. It should be very, very easy. So, but very clear that he is building himself political space, geographic space, that down the road will continue to use violence in stressing, pressuring Armenia's domestic politics and making himself useful for Russia. So looking at the possibility, pushing him, if you intend to drag border delineation for several decades, can we then sign a modus vivendi agreement in the meantime, which basically would commits you to continued peaceful negotiation on this? And let me actually stop here with one more point in regards to the role that the third parties can play in securing, becoming concert of power, so to speak, offering a diplomatic cover in implementing a border agreement. So here, I think down the road, thinking about Russia being part of some sort of an agreement of third-party countries that can guarantee the implementation of a big border agreement definitely is worth considering. But that probably perhaps post-Putin kind of conversation, depending what happens in Ukraine. I probably took more than 10 minutes. I apologize. So I'll stop here.
Thank you very much, Anna, for this impulse, so to speak, this kickstart of our conversation, which I enjoyed very much. And I am particularly grateful that you embedded it, that you embed current developments in the region, in the South Caucasus, in this neo-imperial framework, which I think has, precisely as you say, a lot to teach us, as it is not just obviously touching upon and taking into account the role of other external actors, but in particular, the role of elite networks, transnational elite networks, and what they can bring to the table in the whole reordering dynamic that we are currently witnessing. But we get back to that a little later in the conversation. Nerses, if I could kindly ask you to stick to your 10 minutes, the sooner we have concluded our initial presentation, so to speak, the sooner we can start with the conversation, then also bring in our audience, the better. Over to you.
Thank you, Tobias. I will be covering mostly the foreign policy contours of Armenia and the recent reorientation that we've seen. And by recent, I mean in the last year and a half. And I appreciate Anna's sort of macro conceptual treatment of developments that we've seen. I'm going to reduce my analysis to the regional level and specifically at the state level to qualify developments that we've seen with respect to Armenia's foreign policy shift. Tobias, you mentioned correctly that Armenia's foreign policy for the last 15 years prior to the Velvet Revolution and into the Velvet Revolution was defined by complementarity. Complementarity collapsed after the 2020 war that was initiated by Azerbaijan. And so Armenia, in that sense, transitioned to a policy of strategic engagement, which gave birth to its current policy, and that is one of diversification. But what we saw is that the shift to a more diverse foreign policy led to what became known as Armenia's Western pivot. In that context, to understand the current foreign policy structuration of Armenia, these factors, these developments remain intrinsic. But the most important causal factor that is allowing us to comprehend how Armenia was able to basically undertake this pivot and thus rupture Russia's dominance of the region and specifically of Armenian foreign policy is the fact that the Russian-led security architecture in the South Caucasus completely collapsed after September of 2022. What happened was that as Armenia's security situation immensely deteriorated, Armenia realized that Russia is no longer the security partner that it had presented itself to be. And with Russia's abdication of its security obligations, and more so, Russia's alliance with Azerbaijan in advancing their interest in the region and reinforcing the authoritarian orbit in the region, this triggered Armenia's Western pivot. In this context, what we saw is that while Azerbaijan continued to procure arms to increase the power asymmetry with Armenia, Russia refused to meet its treaty obligations of providing arms at any level or even allowing Armenia to have the most minimal deterrence capability. And so what this did, it reinforced Armenia's complete dependence on Russia, whereas Azerbaijan was given a leeway to enhance its capabilities and further create an unmanageable power parity from the lens of Armenia. So what led to this policy of diversification and the Western pivot was the realization that Russia had become the greatest source of Armenia's insecurity, and because it had provided a false sense of security. So to fracture this unreliable dependent structure, Armenia had one option: to attain hard power and security capabilities from alternative sources. Well, the problem was that access to alternative sources, especially after Russia's invasion of Ukraine, placed Armenia within a conundrum. In the broader Western perspective, Armenia was viewed as a Russian satellite by virtue of the fact that Armenia's previous illiberal regimes had completely placed Armenia within Russia's sphere of influence. And so an inability to exercise an independent foreign and security policy had utterly limited Armenia's ability to have international credibility in addressing its security needs. And so the Western pivot and the decoupling from Russia was an initial necessity to allow Armenia to address its security problems. And so the policy of diversification and the collapse of complementarity was a byproduct of both the structural and the relational factors that we saw disintegrate in the South Caucasus. Now, in this context, Armenia, we saw, did attempt initial stopgap measures by accessing weapons from India and basically attempting to engage in the international market to address the excessive power disparity that it faced with Azerbaijan. But the realization was that a broader policy of diversification was necessary to allow for more access and furthermore to enhance international political capital. So I have qualified Armenia's decoupling from Russia and this process of a Western pivot and diversification as an act of devassalization, meaning whereas Armenia was qualified as a Russian vassal until about 2 years ago, the Western pivot is a process of devassalization. And this kind of aligns with Anna's analysis in the fact that neo-imperial objectives of core periphery relations are fundamentally defined by reinforcing dependent structures and exerting coercive influence upon the periphery. So Armenia's decoupling or devassalization is a negation of this patron-vassal structuring that Russia had been reliant on for the last 30 years. To this end, without a Western pivot, Armenia would have no chance of mitigating the power disparity with Azerbaijan because it would not have access to any alternative sources. And so in this context, Armenia's Western pivot is directional. It was born out of the necessity, the dire necessity of its security environment, and the fact that Russia chose to basically abandon any security interest that Armenia had, and thus allow Azerbaijan to become the dominant actor in the Armenian-Azerbaijan conflict. And so these configurations produced a very, very interesting phenomenon. Armenia pivoted directionally to actually allow itself the capacity to exercise an independent foreign policy. And I have to be very honest here. From 1998 until about 2020, Armenia did not exercise independent foreign policy because it was subjugated to Russia's coercive apparatus. In that context, Armenia always abided by Russian foreign policy interests and always had to get permission from Moscow to basically engage in the behavior that it did. The diversification process and the Western pivot ruptured this. And what we are seeing is Armenia shifting, and it has already shifted in exercising an independent foreign and security policy. And this is intrinsically necessary to allow Armenia to both engage in the type of behavior necessary to advance its national interest, while at the same time leading to the collapse of Russia's southern security architecture. So conceptually, what we've seen is that the entirety of Russia's southern architecture, security architecture, was hinged upon Armenia serving as the cornerstone of Russia's southern security flank. By Armenia decoupling from Russia and thus rupturing this 30-year security architecture, Russia's once singular dominance of the South Caucasus has ended. It doesn't mean Russia is still not a power player, but it is not the singular power player. And this has brought about what I call geopolitical pluralism in the region. In this context, the intersecting geostrategic, geoeconomic, and geosecurity configurations are no longer defined by a singular Russian presence. What we have seen is the presence of the United States. We have seen the very active presence of the European Union. And in this context, what was once completely deemed the backyard of Russia is no longer the case. And so geopolitical pluralism has allowed Armenia to create a nascent security architecture. Thus, instead of the region being under the homogeneous dominance of Russia and leaving Armenia at the mercy of Russian negligence and Azerbaijani belligerence, Armenia is now finding alternative prospects of developing its security architecture. And so when we, observe these developments, by training, I am a neoclassical realist. When we integrate sort of, the scholarship on the subject matter, what we see is that in the confluence of the region's realignment of power interests and Armenia's posturing within this complex environment, this is where we see Armenia proceeding with two important policies: diversification, and, to borrow from the neoclassical literature, geographical bandwagoning. And so the rupturing of the Russian-led dominance of the region and Armenia's pivotal role in allowing that rupture to happen by basically removing Armenia from the Russian architecture, security architecture in the South Caucasus, allowed for geopolitical pluralism to become the current state of what we could call power competition or power engagement in the region. Now, to quickly kind of sum up the sort of the nuances of Armenia's foreign policy orientation, we need to understand that diversification is defined by allowing Armenia to utilize what's known as an and policy and not an either-or policy. In this context, whereas in the past, it was a question of balancing global powers, or being able to maintain a capacity of balance between the East and the West, or the West and Russia. This ruptured because balancing requires certain level of capability and capacity that a vassal state cannot have. In this context, Armenia has never balanced anything. Armenia had an either-or policy, and every time Russia would tell Armenia, is it us or is it the West, Armenia had no choice but to acquiesce. But the recent shift in the policy orientation has produced an end-to-end policy, where Armenia's underlying argument is that we are not taking a West-centric, Russia-centric, or any notion of centrified discourse here, but rather we are proceeding with an Armenia-centric policy. Thus, our approach is end-to-end, where we engage in the actors that are active within the pluralistic power configurations of the region to advance Armenia's interests. Now, considering the fact that the West is playing a more constructive role in the region, clearly Armenia's pivot qualifies in a Western direction because it basically steps away directionally from the Russian dependency structure. But how is Armenia going about doing this? Armenia is using the concept of co-alignment. And what this entails is that Armenia simultaneously develops strategic partnerships with given countries with whom it could ascertain tangible assistance. And thus, it allows Armenia to engage in what we call issue splitting, where it operationalizes co-alignment by basically engaging countries on issue-specific relations. So on security, where there has been a complete collapse on the Russian hand, Armenia has done issue splitting and co-alignment with India, with France. We have developing conversations with the United States. It is having developed conversations, for example, with Greece, etc., etc. These are examples of issue splitting and co-alignment. And the European Union has also integrated itself into this discourse by allowing Armenia access to non-lethal aid, or giving Armenia the basics of developing a comprehensive security doctrine, resiliency training, the best practices in developing small state security capabilities to address its limitations. So what we've seen is that the policies of diversification, which are defined by co-alignment and issue splitting, have allowed Armenia to engage in segmentization, where they take various segments within its security and foreign policy needs, and they engage with specific countries to ascertain both tangible assistance while also enhancing Armenia's capabilities. And so to wrap it up, overarchingly, if Armenia did not undertake its shift to a Western pivoted posture, if it did not engage in a policy of diversification, it would not be able to address its security necessities because the Russian security architecture that defined its security needs completely collapsed. And so to this end, Armenia's Western pivot and its policy of diversification is fundamentally driven by its dire security situation and the need to find alternative solutions and diversified solutions to its problems. I'll stop here and then I'll be happy to address any specific questions.
Thank you very much, Nerses, for this presentation of yours, which I think chimes very much with what Anna has been saying, giving it to some extent, not necessarily overall, but to some extent, a slightly different twist, not least in light of this sort of neoclassical realist perspective that you added to the debate. What I find quite interesting when listening to you is, in fact, that both of you, coming from rather different angles, agree on one very particular point, and that is, to paraphrase from your presentation, Anna, that Russia has lost its centrality in the connectivity in Eurasia and thus also in the South Caucasus. The question that this poses to me, at least, was while listening to you was actually, okay, but then how should we interpret these most recent developments in 2020, in September 2023 and subsequently, as in, have they been preceding this loss of centrality in this regional connectivity, or are they actually the result of this, say, decline of the past regional security architecture very much dominated by Russia? And how can we explain, as a matter of fact, that Russia is no longer the sole security provider, the sole hegemon in the region? Is this a deliberate development? Is it an accidental development? Is it the result of Russia's engagement now in Ukraine? What to make of it? Because obviously, you could make the point, and I think both of you have very aptly pointed to this, actually, that as a result of this changing configuration and reordering, and what would I want to say, recalibration, so to speak, geopolitical recalibration in the region, Armenia, and now to borrow from you, Nerses, is in the process of devassalization. But again, the bigger question is, okay, so how to make sense of then those developments in the past years in relation to this loss of centrality and connectivity? Anna, could you maybe share your views on this particular point?
So if I understand the question correctly, Tobias, you're asking how this argument on Russia's loss of centrality relates to Russia's behavior in
Right.
South Caucasus.
Yes, exactly.
So on the one hand, I think, first of all, I've always argued in my writing, when people would describe Armenia-Russia relations as an alliance, I did not subscribe to that view, because Russia's approach to the South Caucasus has been neo-imperial. And I don't mean this as a derogatory term. When I do say neo-imperial, I'm trying to capture the attempt of any imperial power worth its name in maintaining full influence over the region. So the fact that Russia was selling weapons to both Armenia and Azerbaijan and then justifying, well, if we don't sell it, someone else will, right? It falls very much in that context. So in terms of this Pax Russica, people argue, for example, when you argue, well, the Russian support, Russia was provided such good security, and then now it can't, that also I do not fully embrace, simply because the causes of that stability were multiple. For example, we should be asking, how come Azerbaijan didn't attack Armenia for that many years? And why did it attack in 2016 and then in 2010? And if you map those attacks with the decline in oil prices, I'm not claiming causation, but it's very hard not to see that the cycle of Azerbaijani violence in Nagorno-Karabakh and on Armenia and the oil prices seem to be going hand in hand. So whether Azerbaijan was behaving because Russia was such an effective provider of deterrence for Armenia, I'm not sure. At the very least, we should not be, I just do not see enough to say that. We have no evidence to say that that was the case, as opposed to Azerbaijan wanting the relative stability, to focus on selling the oil, integrate itself, et cetera, but we should be asking, should we been paying more attention to how Azerbaijan as a declining petrostate is behaving? And there's scholarship on that too. So all I'm saying is that I think we do, when you look at the region from pure geopolitics that looks at relations primarily between state-to-state relations without looking at the institutions inside these states, how these states behave, I think we miss a lot. In regards to Russia's Azerbaijani 2020 attack on Nagorno-Karabakh, and then subsequently the blockade and the ethnic cleansing while there are multiple tracks of a peace process, many analysts in Armenia are convinced that the 2020 attack was orchestrated by Russia and Azerbaijan. I can't claim that. I tend to be the same way that I can claim that Russia provided security for Armenia, the same way I cannot claim that Russia orchestrated that or there was deep coordination. Maybe there, I just do not, I'm a scholar, so I tend to be conservative. But in regards to after 2022, Russia's preferences, this is where Russian invasion in Ukraine is so important, because in doing that, yes, the structure of the conflict in Ukraine has been building since 2014, absolutely. But at the same time, this is a very distinct war of conquest. As such, Russia will be emerging from Ukraine as a revisionist player. So as a revisionist player of the multipolarity, ironically, within which Russia's new imperial model was fitting really well, right? That is the ironic sad part. But as Russia is emerging from 2022 as a revisionist player, that puts Russia in direct confrontation with small states like Armenia, which very much depend on the liberal principles of ordering that are based on norms against conquest, norms against aggression, right? So this is in that respect. So now going back to the decline, Russia's loss of centrality, Russia is still a formidable player in South Caucasus, but it lost its bargaining power. So relative to the state. So I will stop here, which elevates the strength of small states in strengthening their institutions, which is crucial in managing Russia.
Thank you very much, Anna. Picking up precisely on this last or second last point that you just mentioned, namely that Russia lost its bargaining power. I want to go to you, Nerses, and ask precisely that. Yes, I think we can all relate to the fact that this Western pivot and this de-vassalization, as you put it, this diversification of foreign policy, in a way, is a necessity. It's born out of the most recent developments. At the same time, taking into account, precisely as was said previously, that Russia may no longer be the singular player, but still is an important player. How much leverage does the current government have to pursue this foreign policy diversification, this end-to-end foreign policy, as you put it? Because at the end of the day, the dependency structure that both of you related to in your respective presentations are still very much in place.
Thank you for the question. I would argue that this dependency structure has been ruptured. The security dependency structure has completely been ruptured. The energy security structure is a processing work, and the economic one is not so much dependency, because Russia needs right now the sort of the levers of economic dividends that they're receiving from the Eurasian Economic Union more than the other members might, given the situation. So in this context, I think dependency has been both mitigated and it's become more reciprocal, specifically in the economic realm. So the configurations in that context have changed. And this clearly has to do with two factors. I'm very happy both of you mentioned the Ukraine war, in the sense that, in my studies, when I do study hegemony and sub-regional hegemony, and we basically talk about concentration of power and dispersion of power. What we saw is that because in the region, Russia had attained so much concentration of power, it never crossed its mind that any of its vassals would be able to pivot out of its structure, out of its dominance. So in this context, it is Russia's failings, or generally its inability to attain what it wanted to attain in Ukraine, that has produced the exogenous effect in the South Caucasus with respect to its status as a diminishing hegemon. And so the dispersion of Russia's concentrated power in the region and the birth of geopolitical pluralism has produced the opportunity for Armenia to be able to engage in diversification and thus rupture the dependency structure. So dependency is reinforced by hegemonic dominance. When there's a diminishing of hegemonic capability, the dependency levers also diminish. In this context, I think Armenia is being able to do what it is doing by virtue of these developments. So there isn't a contradiction right now, or sort of a paradox between the and either or posturing. If the Ukraine war did not happen, I agree, we would not be having this conversation, because Russia's concentration of power in the region would have sustained itself. That's why I note that its complexities in the Ukraine war is the exogenous factor that explains the power dispersion in the region. But to quickly touch up on another important point, which, I think poses a very good question, right? Why did Azerbaijan attack in 2020? And was basically the posturing of Russia as the leading security actor in the region a bit of a bubble? And what did this bubble burst? And I'm going to quickly touch up on the scholarship on this, in the sense that authoritarian regimes do not make allies, right? They usually prefer patron-vassal relationship. So I think, as Anna noted, and I've subscribed to this for a long time, Russia was never Armenia's ally. It always views itself as Russia's patron. And so in this context, when the conflict broke out, Russia did not think it was incumbent upon itself to help an ally. Russia was merely viewed as too small actor in its backyard, basically having a squabble, and at the end of the day, Russia will conflict mismanage and align it with its interests. That was its approach. The fact that it didn't proceed that way, and the Ukraine war produced the results that it did, are kind of the determining factors in that context. So I think it's very important to keep that in mind. I think I'll stop here, and then we'll take more questions.
Thank you very much, Nerses. We have already received 2 questions here from some of our participants. Before I open the Q&A and bring in these questions, allow me to just raise one more question and connect it to the request to both of you to be very brief, so we have enough time for the Q&A, and link what we have been discussing maybe to a larger extent to domestic development in Armenia, and the very fact that it seems, at least from the outside, that the reform momentum that Pashinyan had and benefited from for the first, say, 2 years in particular, but this has sort of vanished over the past couple of years, 4 years, I would say 3 to 4 years. And in taking that into account, I'm actually wondering whether we could also make the argument that, cynical as it may be, that for Pashinyan, what has been happening is to some extent even a quote-unquote convenient dynamic that in fact allows and enables him to generate new public support, new political momentum in a situation, precisely as I said, where this sort of domestic political reform seemed to have stalled. Precisely because there seems to be a large segment of society that has understood that Russia is no longer the reliable strategic ally that it was supposed to be in the past, and that a lot of blame goes precisely into that direction. So in that sense, is this Western pivot, this diversification of foreign policy that we are witnessing, an opportunity for him, to sort of distract from this rather poor reform dynamic that we are currently witnessing or have been witnessing in Armenia for some time now? And secondly, a tool to sort of regain popularity and strengthen his legitimacy? Over to the two of you, very briefly.
Nerses, do you want to take it?
Yeah, I'll take this. I just a few questions, a few points that I'll make really quick. I do agree that the reforms to some extent have slowed down. They have completely not stalled. But listen, the literature, all the scholarship shows that undertaking reforms amidst a security crisis is nearly impossible, right? So Armenia basically has territories that are occupied by Azerbaijan with a daily threat of another incursion. Russia fully works against the government, as Tobias initially mentioned, in seeking to develop domestic instability. You have what Anna and I call the authoritarian vestiges, the illiberal opposition that are remnants of the previous regime, trying to undertake some form of a regime change that is not democratic. And amidst all this, the configurations are basically quite complex. So between state survival and multitude of security threats that are being severely confronted by the state, reforms obviously are going to be slow and have complexities. This is not an excuse as to why reforms weren't as robust or as rigid initially. But overarchingly, right, we saw the experience from Eastern Europe and Latin America. Reforms take at least a decade to materialize with immense external support. EU pumped billions into East Central Europe. Latin America is still reforming. And so Armenia's situation is unique in the sense that it is going through the transitology process of reforms while within being the structure of a security crisis. So I think this is important to address. But at the same time, its economy is the fastest growing economy in the Eurasian space. And so the reforms, whatever there have been, of demonopolizing, of having a fairly equal and open competitive market economy, of sort of extensive investments in various sectors are producing dividends. So those factors need to be kind of aligned. And as far as the current government goes, the biggest fact that is helping the current government to be continuously elected is the fact that Armenia does not have sufficient pluralism in the electoral field. The problem why you don't have sufficient pluralism in the electoral field is that the opposition is occupied by the authoritarian vestiges. And this simply allows the Pashinyan government or his political party to consistently win elections, because when the Armenian people are given a choice, it's simply not much of a choice. And therefore, you have what you have. Also, when we look at the data, right, the prime minister has a very solid, consistent 35% of society. That is his political base. In parliamentary political systems, as we know, when you have a strong 35% base, while the opposition tends to be a collection of alliances or uninstitutionalized political parties, the undecided voter is always going to lean towards the dominant party or not show up, and therefore your 35% is going to overperform. So these dynamics, these structural factors are better explaining developments. When will Armenia have sufficient political pluralism where you will see robust competition? Well, if we pay attention to the recent elections that we had for the capital of Yerevan municipal elections, this was actually the most pluralistic turnout the Eurasian space has seen, where you had at least 5 parties performing really, really well, and you had to engage in coalition building. So when you look at these structural factors, there has been quite a bit of progress, specifically in democratic culture and political culture. And the fact that all this is happening amidst a security crisis, I think that exogenous factor has to be taken in to consideration. And of course, among all of this, it's not a section of society, Tobias. The recent IRI survey clearly showed that it's a vast majority of Armenian society, nearly 88-90%, support closer relations with the West, and nearly 70% consider Russia to be a problematic partner. No one speaks of alliances anymore. So I think the entirety of the Russian soft power in the country has collapsed, and the pro-Western, the organic pro-Western support is there. How the PM proceeds from there in addressing the security dilemma is going to be the defining factor, because the domestic arena seems to be a lot more stable than most see.
Thank you. That was very illuminating. To bring in our participants, we have some, well, say max 10 minutes. We have received 3 questions, and I would actually want to pick the very first one, even though it was raised last, and give it to you, Anna. And this is by a colleague of mine, Marina Rabinovich, who asks, a colleague of mine, Cindy Wittke, framed the Minsk peace accords for Ukraine as a, quote, formalized political unsettlement, unquote. What is the risk of formalizing unsettlement rather than finding a solution to border delimitation issues between Azerbaijan and Armenia? Question mark. Anna.
It's a great way of thinking about the peace process, formalizing unsettlement. And I really did not think of the Armenian peace process in light of the Minsk processes in the Eastern Ukraine. So I agree with the general framing of the question. And I would take this as an opportunity to connect to what I said a little in my presentation, that strategically, it's much, much more important if we're thinking about regional peace. Again, Armenia is facing a declining personalized petrostate. Armenia, the challenge of Armenian security is to keep Aliyev tied at the negotiating table, because he's looking for a territorial conflict. And we know how, now he knows how to build one because he saw Russia do it. So I agree with this framing, but I would say that border delimitation, I would put a lot more emphasis, if I was the Armenian government and its Western supporters or its supporters from Asia, a lot more, its border delimitation is a lot more important than the peace agreement. That's number one. And number two, peace processes, building peace is so complicated. Peace agreement in general, which is why I'm so worried that the expectations are so heightened for a possible peace agreement between the two. And looks like Marina Rabinovich is sharing that concern. Peace processes are structural factors that lead to a peace process. Right now, the biggest driver, even as Armenia is trying to open borders, the crossroads for peace, all of that is wonderful, right, and important. But Azerbaijan does not have a productive economy. Big chunk of its exports are oil-based. So unless Azerbaijan transitions to become an economically more normalized state, expecting that a peace process can be translated into peaceful conditions on the ground is unrealistic. So moreover, I think negotiations between Armenians, he already has shown that he can use the peace process to build a hybrid war and kind of into this limited, manageable sort of violent episodes would usually precede a bigger attack. So I share the concern, but if the Europeans, if the West is serious about peace building in the region, the support that Armenia gets is just not sufficient. It's just administratively, politically, institutionally, just looking at what EU did in the Balkans is one example. The West does need to come out much stronger on the regional, on this crossroads for peace approach that Pashinyan is trying to advance. So I share the framework, but I would say border delimitation is more important in keeping Azerbaijan tied to the negotiation table for the next decade or two.
Thank you very much, Anna. I would like to link 2 questions that we have received one of which was raised by Kristina Pitalskaya and the other by my colleague Arusyak Aleksanyan from the Center of European Studies at YSU. And the question is basically about the security risks that would come along with this Western pivot. And Arusyak, I think, does a great job by just pointing to some continuously existing dependencies, as Russian foreign trade turnover, as she says, is around 40%. Russia continues to maintain its position as the leading investor with a 70% share in FDI, and so on and so forth. Armenia's continuous participation in the Eurasian Economic Union. We see what is happening in Georgia. Kristina is pointing to that in her question. So in other words, and Arusyak puts it very poignantly, how can this Western pivot continue to occur and consolidate smoothly without significant stress for Armenia? Nerses, could you just elaborate?
Sorry. Can I start on this one and
Sure.
over to
I just have to call on you to be quick and concise.
Super quick. So I do share the worries. I think both questions, I very much share the concern that are posted here. Overall, and I'm curious as to what Nerses thinks about this. Overall, when I look at Armenia's foreign policy, I'm not so sure, although I like Nerses' definition, when he definition of a Western pivot. But when I do look at Armenia's foreign policy in managing Russia in this context, I do think it's a lot more diversification than a specific Western pivot. But in terms of the Arusyak Aleksanyan's points about the significant share of Russian present economy, I think in the literature, looking at some research on within the neo-colonial framework, those former colonies that after independence, if they maintain trade relationships with the metropole, they're less likely to be attacked. This is not a high quantitative study, but it's a few cases, but kind of intuitively makes sense, which also applies to Turkey as well. So I don't think that even if Armenia deepens its relations with the West, even if it joins the European Union, that should come at the expense of cutting ties with Russia. Not that it's even in the hands of the Armenian government. I don't think it's realistic, and I don't think the West should push Armenia to pick sides. I agree that Georgia has paid the price for it, Ukraine. I don't want to blame the victim, but I think there should be a strategy for small states and not geopoliticizing their democratic transitions, their economic trajectories. I'll stop here, but I agree with the worries, both from Kristina Pitalskaya and Arusyak Aleksanyan.
Real quickly, this is follows the sort of the paradigmatic thinking of the either-or logic, and that has been instilled in how we qualify the region. But if we're talking about co-alignment and we're talking about segmentation, the transition, the diversification can actually achieve its objectives if Armenia handles it correctly, right? As I noted, the Western pivot doesn't mean abandoning or antagonizing Russia. It's directional. You can only pivot west to basically escape Russia's dependency structure, right? So let's call it an independence pivot, and because the term west produces a lot of misunderstanding, right? Now, are there risks intrinsic to this? Of course they are. Russia doesn't tolerate any of its vassals or former colonies, right? Or satellites, whatever term you want to use, from escaping its authoritarian orbit. So the risks are going to be there. Ukraine is paying for that as we speak. Georgia paid for it in 2008. Armenia paid for it in 2020 and continues paying for it by Russia allowing Azerbaijan to do what it does, the CSTO playing dumb, and overall basically saying, we don't know what's going on in Armenia because we don't recognize its borders. So there's a overarching process here as well. So the risks are going to be there. The question is, how do you mitigate those risks? And this is where diversification offers alternative approaches and resources and access to capacity building that otherwise you would not have. So this is sort of the way that I would frame these developments. I take Arusyak's question quite well on the economic component. In the sense that, yes, the process of diversification does continue, but structurally, because your economy for 30 years has been integrated and has been intrinsic in regional engagement and through the Russia model, right, or Russia dominant model, clearly you cannot leave that momentarily, because while security can be addressed with few hard power support and extensive diplomatic pressure on Azerbaijan or whatever, economic factors take a long time, right? You can't just pump money into Armenia and overnight create markets for the Armenian thing, producer and consumer. So in that context, her point is very well taken, in that the European Union has to be very realistic and what they're demanding of Armenia with respect to leaving the Eurasian, withdrawing from the Eurasian Economic Union. Clearly, if Europe provides an alternative that mitigates the 70% of the threat, the economic threat that Armenia will receive from leaving the EU, Eurasian Union, I'm sure everybody would run to it. But if an immediate solution isn't going to be presented to the severe threat that it risks, I think we have to be a bit realistic on that. And very quickly on the Georgia point, I don't qualify Georgia's current developments as being geopolitical in the sense that Georgia Dream is following orders from Russia. I think I'm sure there's literature scholarships going to support this, but Georgia did not sufficiently develop democratic institutions, and so we're going to see how resilient its democratic institutions are on this power move that Ivanishvili and Georgia Dream are doing. We have to remember that this whole foreign agent law was birthed when the Europeans very correctly told Georgia that you have to have anti-oligarchic laws, which was directly targeted at Ivanishvili. And what Georgia Dream did is basically they reinterpreted this and utilized it as a weapon against NGOs and civic society. So this is more of an attempt at Ivanishvili to manage the opposition and manage future election and basically kind of do what Erdogan and Orban have been doing in Turkey and Hungary, to develop a political system where it's a hybrid regime with some sprinkles of democratic elements, but it keeps him in power. So this is more driven by domestic configurations, although it does look a lot like what Russia would do. But I have a hard time believing that they're taking orders from Russia, even though right now their interests seem to be aligning more than the others. And finally, Armsec did have a question about the marches that are taking place in Armenia, or sort of, the domestic protests. These have become very common. Vibrant democracies have these. Even Armenia's anti-democratic opposition uses the mechanisms of democratic movements to express frustration or anger, and this is welcome. You would much rather have these kinds of civic engaged activities, right? And I have written about this, as opposed to having, a militarized or violent-driven activities. How are these protests going to turn out? Well, we have seen that protests that generally don't tend to be organic or have some involvement of the opposition of the authoritarian vestiges do not tend to do well. And interestingly, these protests are being led by the church, who most of Armenian society accepts as being extensions of the previous regime. So there's a heavy politicization to the grassroots configuration of these developments. And unless it, mushrooms into something that's organic, it's simply going to be very similar to what we saw in 2021 and 2022, when the opposition attempted to do something, but it did not galvanize society.
Thank you very much, Nerses. This was very comprehensive and at the same time very concise. We have already gone beyond the time that we wanted to devote to this webinar. However, with your permission, I would like to just read out the very first question, in fact, that was raised by one of our participants, an anonymous attendee, in fact, and ask each one of you to just reflect on it and share with us your views in 1 minute, as said, precisely on the Turkey point, which has not yet been addressed in this conversation. So in other words, how does Turkey's increased influence in the region affect Armenia's security situation? And I would want to add, also in light of the fact that, from what I know, Azerbaijan, Baku, the Aliyev regime is heavily influencing, heavily lobbying the foreign ministry in Ankara to not engage with Yerevan. A minute each. Anna, you're first.
Okay. So I think it's fascinating to me that Azerbaijan has so much influence over Turkey. With Russia's historic decline, for the reasons, the sort of this loss of central connectivity, all of that I mentioned, this is a unique opportunity for Turkey to emerge as a regional power, responsible regional power. There's scholarship on this variable called regionhood. For example, the role that Brazil plays in Latin America, South Africa plays in Southern Africa. So when Turkey is compared to these regional players, Turkey ranks very, very low in terms of this regionness. So this is a unique opportunity for Turkey to emerge as a responsible regional player and a country that is wedged in European structures to, while playing its quote-unquote strategic autonomy, to deepen the liberal organizing principle of ordering from which Turkey would benefit. Border security, border stability, I mentioned. So in this respect, Turkey is losing and is allowing Azerbaijan to shape its policy. And I do think a lot depends on where Turkey moves, partly because Turkey's authoritarian decline, personalization of power, that probably has to do with the fact as to why Turkey is not behaving differently. Opening of the border with Armenia would be beneficial for Armenia, but it also would be hugely beneficial for Turkey as well, both for developing the underdeveloped Eastern Turkish region, where there's a large Kurdish population concentration. There are all kinds of other reasons as well as to how Turkey would benefit. So a lot depends as to where Turkey is moving, but even in context, I think Turkey is losing by allowing Azerbaijan to dictate policy inside Turkey on Turkish foreign policy.
Thank you, Anna. Nerses.
Real quickly, I think if you look at Turkey's broader foreign and security policy, they're more preoccupied clearly with developments in Syria, in northern Kurdistan, in Iraq, and of course they've tried to spread out into Libya, into the Mediterranean. So Turkey views itself as a broader regional actor. It fancies itself as a middle power, and the South Caucasus remains somewhat of a small space for them to apply those resources. And their strategy, therefore, has been one of proxyizing Azerbaijan to represent Turkish interests in the region. And so in this context of proxyization, as long as Azerbaijan doesn't do anything that contradicts Turkey's interests, which it hasn't, they have a very symbiotic relationship in advancing Turkish interests in the South Caucasus. And of course, when we talk about the South Caucasus, when we look at Georgia, Turkey has immense investments and influence in Georgia as well. So in that context, if we're really looking at the degree of influence that Turkey might have only on Armenia in the region, that's not much of a concern for Turkey because Azerbaijan is the perfect instrument in advancing its interest in the region. But as far as the question, right, how does this influence the security situation with Armenia? It influences it detrimentally. Because if it has farmed out or proxyized its interest in the region to a very bellicose, aggressive actor like Aliyev is going to instrumentalize whatever components it has in its relation with Turkey to harm Armenia. So I agree with Anna. If Turkey was basically proactively engaging in the region, their approach would have been more constructive. But they have preferred to basically apply their resources, their limited resources, to other regions that surround them and to basically allow Azerbaijan, within given parameters, to run the South Caucasus with respect to Turkish interests.
Thank you very much, Nerses. I think this again chimes very nicely with what Anna has been saying. Unfortunately, we have to draw this session to a close. I think I can speak on behalf of each and everyone that joined us this afternoon, this morning, so to speak, when I say that this was an extremely insightful and interesting and thought-provoking webinar. I'm not surprised, I have to say. I've been following your respective readings for quite some time, have been using them myself. In that sense, I kind of knew what to expect. And I would like to take this opportunity to thank the two of you, Anna and Nerses, for contributing to this webinar. And as I said, for being with us here in this particular context and for sharing with us your vast knowledge on Armenia and the region. Likewise, I would like to thank our attendees, our participants, also for having been patient, for having put up with me and this poor time management on my part We are some 12 minutes beyond schedule. Forgive me for that, but I think it was all worth it. Should any one of you want to learn more about REDEMOS, please look at our website. For those of you who are in Armenia these days or permanently based even in Armenia, as I said, prior to this webinar, to Anna and Nerses, REDEMOS is going to have a very interesting, I believe, public multi-stakeholder event next Monday at the Yerevan State University, where we actually continue the conversation, picking up on many of the points that we have addressed today. Should you be interested in this event, drop me a line or contact my colleagues at the Center for European Studies at YSU. Finally, I would like to ask each and everyone to give our two speakers at least a virtual applause for their, as I said, very comprehensive and thought-provoking insights. Thank you very much, and I hope to see all of you around some point soon. Take good care, and thank you again. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.